Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very important and timely conversation with Jordan Denari Duffner on her new book, Islamophobia, What Christians Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination. I'm very excited for this talk as Jordan and I have worked alongside each other here at Bridge, and I've learned so much from her and her work. I'll be in conversation with Jordan for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for an audience Q&A. So please be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A specific chat function. If you're going to be tweeting about the event, be sure to use the hashtag Islamophobia and Christians. A little bit about Jordan. She's a PhD student in theological and religious studies at Georgetown University and is an associate of the Bridge Initiative. She is the author of Finding Jesus Among Muslims, How Loving Islam Makes Me a Better Catholic. And her writing on Muslim-Christian relations and Islamophobia has appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post, Time, and America. In her new book, Islamophobia, What Christians Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination, Jordan examines how Christians have contributed to anti-Muslim prejudice and discrimination, and how the community, using tools rooted in faith, can work to dismantle it. She provides an introduction to the problem of Islamophobia, providing her own definition of it and highlighting its manifestations in both domestic and foreign environments. Jordan views Islamophobia as both a social justice and a religious freedom issue. She provides practical guidance for our audience, specifically aimed towards Christians, on how to address Islamophobia through the lens of faith. This is the first book written specifically for Christians that seeks to comprehensively address Islamophobia. I highly recommend you all purchase it, as it really is an invaluable resource. So Jordan, I'm going to begin with my first question. When I read your book, it provides such a holistic and detailed overview of Islamophobia. You cover a wide range of topics addressing the war on terror, surveillance of Muslims, hate crimes, bullying of children in schools, outlining Sharia, defining jihad, going over the Muslim ban, talking about the Patriot Act, talking about the problem around the term terrorism, and so much more. And this is just one part of the book, and the other part provides a framework from a Christian perspective for a Christian audience on how to tackle Islamophobia. Why did you feel it was important to write this book specifically for a Christian audience?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Mubashara, and to the ACMCU and Bridge for hosting this event. It's really great to be able to talk to you specifically, Mubashara, because like you said, we've been in conversation and worked together for so long, and you even read a number of drafts of the chapters of the book. And so I think you know it really well and have taught me a lot in this whole process too. So I'm really excited that we're able to talk about it. Yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised that there's a book about Islamophobia written for a Christian audience. But there are two reasons why I think Christians are called to learn about Islamophobia and to try to do something about it. And the first has to do with the fact that religious discrimination, no matter whom it targets, is something that's wrong, and it's a grave injustice. And I think Christians, we know this as human beings, but we also know this from our faith. Religious discrimination goes against the most basic Christian values of love of neighbor, and it's a betrayal of the human dignity that we believe that people are endowed with by God. And so even though we may not be the targets of this form of religious discrimination, I think it's something that we need to address. There are so many different social issues that Christians might not be affected by personally, but that we're compelled to do something about simply because they're wrong, and because we want to build up a world where people's human dignity is honored. So that's one of the reasons, kind of the baseline reason why I think Christians should be concerned about Islamophobia and why I've written this book. The other reason is because, unfortunately, Christians have contributed to this problem of Islamophobia. And I give lots of different examples of this in the book. I think of pastors and ministers who have made false or uncharitable comments about Muslims, Christian politicians or personalities on social media who advocate for policies that discriminate against Muslims. And you also have violent actions that are taken by Christians against Muslims. You have vandalisms of mosques. And I open the book actually with a story of a person vandalizing a mosque and actually marking their vandalism with crosses, like with a Christian symbol. But I think also Islamophobia in Christian communities is often perpetuated in really subtle ways and sometimes in unintentional ways, because we have absorbed some of these common stereotypes about Muslims and we replicate them and normalize them in our community, sometimes without even recognizing them. So that's one of the reasons also why it's important for us to do something about Islamophobia. And, you know, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, you know, Muslims, as people being on the receiving end of bigotry, shouldn't have to advocate for themselves alone. This isn't Muslims' problem to solve. Actually, we have a role here, particularly because we, whether intentionally or not, have sometimes played into this. And I also think that we have an opportunity as Christians to better live out our faith by engaging in this social justice and religious freedom work on behalf of another religious community. I think it's fully consonant with who we are as Christians. The other thing that I want to say about this too, why I wrote it for Christians specifically, is because in my work with Christian communities over the last several years, particularly in the wake of writing my first book about my own experiences of dialogue with Muslims, I wanted to be able to speak directly to some of the hesitancies that Christians have about Muslims and about Islam. I think one of the things that became apparent to me in some of the outreach that I've done is that Christians are sometimes hesitant to open themselves up to Muslims and to join this fight against Islamophobia because they have this perception that Muslims don't actually care about us. They only see kind of negative manifestations of Islam in the media. They may not know Muslims personally. They're not aware of all of the ways that Muslims are doing good for them. You know, Christians will walk up to me after events and say, you know, I see why Islamophobia is wrong, but what about Christian persecution by Muslims? And, you know, the point that I make is I said, first of all, you know, yes, that's a problem. Secondly, there are a lot of Muslims who don't approve of this and who are actively trying to help remedy this problem. And also third, you know, we need to remember that our obligation to help other people isn't contingent on the good they do for us. Like the golden rule applies even if people aren't doing good for us. But the point I make is like Muslims are also doing good too. Yeah. So, you know, those are some of the things that I wanted to speak to because I know that they're stumbling blocks for Christians getting into this work. Yeah.
And you touched on, you know, you talk about the subtle ways Christians might engage in Islamophobia without knowing it. You also talk in your book about, you know, the Islamophobia we don't see. You talk about this hidden Islamophobia. Can you give us some examples of this and why you think it's important to highlight it?
Yeah, so I think many readers of this book will come to it with an awareness of certain overt forms of Islamophobia, like hate crimes against Muslims. I think most people who pick up this book will have heard about the really heinous murder, for example, of Muslim family members in Canada recently, which was born out of anti-Muslim animus. I mean, that's a very obvious case of Islamophobia. And people are by and large aware of those sorts of things. Or things like the Trump Muslim ban. I think many readers will come to this book knowing about these sorts of forms of Islamophobia. They're really hard to ignore. But similar to other forms of racism and discrimination, Islamophobia is more than just the conscious and blatant bigotry. It also manifests at an institutional level and in, you know, as we were saying, in these kind of subtle and unconscious ways. And so when I talk about this hidden or like unseen Islamophobia, it's not hidden to Muslims. Like Muslims are very aware, as you know, like of these forms of Islamophobia and often experience them on like a very personal level. What I'm trying to convey here is that like to Christians, to people in my community, these forms of Islamophobia often go unseen, in part because they're not widely reported in the media, or because we're just not conscious of the fact that we even hold on to stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
So I touch on a lot of different things. To give one example of like institutionalized or government Islamophobia, I talk about a young Muslim in New York City, Asad Dandia, who as a college student ran a Muslim charity organization. And he's written about this as well, and I incorporated some of his story into the book, where a new member joined this Muslim charity group and was really involved in the service work that they were doing, was coming to the mosque with them, all of these sorts of things. And then they found out after this new young man had become a part of the group, that he was actually an informant, like a spy, charged with infiltrating this Muslim charity group as part of an NYPD Muslim spying program, which was basically created with the premise that Muslims are inherently suspect, that Muslims are prone to violence, are seditious. And some of these programs, around the country actually are looking to stir up trouble and actually like lure Muslims. It's called entrapment, like luring Muslims into committing crimes that can then be charged for terrorism, in terrorism cases. These are the kinds of things that like my community has no clue are going on. And so I felt it was really important to talk about that. And then another thing too is this whole issue of implicit bias, which fortunately I think many readers will be familiar with from other reading they might have done on other forms of prejudice. But yeah, we carry bias in ourselves more than just the consciously held ideas that we have. And I tell some stories in the book, which were really graciously offered to me by family members, where their kind of implicit biases about Muslims became apparent to them. And they realized, oh, wow, I was actually operating out of a stereotype here that I shouldn't have been. And I know that this is wrong. It's wrong to think this about Muslims. And yet I still was affected by it anyway. So what I try to do is shine a light on these forms of hidden Islamophobia and to draw the connections between them and then the more overt forms that people are already aware of.
And we just got out of 4 years of the Trump administration, and a lot of the times I think also in the media we see Islamophobia being presented as a partisan issue, as something that only the right engages in. But we know from our research and our understanding that it's not just something that is a problem amongst the right. And you clearly lay this out in your book. You talk about how anti-Muslim racism exists both on the right and left. Can you give us some examples that you touch on of how the left and Democrats have employed Islamophobia?
Yeah, so I think on the left, Islamophobia is often more unconscious. Democrats, particularly in the Trump era, I think prided themselves on the fact that they stood with Muslims against Trump's rhetoric and anti-Muslim policies. And I think among liberals, there's often this kind of like even a superiority complex that like we're not as bigoted as people on the right, and that actually makes people on the left more unable to actually interrogate the biases that they might have and be kind of unwilling to look inward. But these stereotypes exist on the left too. And I give some examples of this in the book. I talk about how some conversations that I've had with like your quintessential like coastal elites, like people who are progressively minded and who think of themselves as sort of being on the right side of things, but who have honestly made some of the most anti-Muslim comments that I've ever heard. And that's because, regardless of the side of the political spectrum you're on, so much of our like self-definition as Western people is contingent on having this view of Muslims as like the opposite of whatever we see ourselves to be. So if we see ourselves as progressive and supportive of women's rights and democratic and peaceful, like Muslims are the opposite of that. And so that permeates politics on both sides of the aisle, and also just our public, our public discourse too. And I talk about in that section of the book how this is one of the ways that Islamophobia brings the right and the left together. And I give some examples of like individuals on the far left, or on the left and then on the right, who have actually come together and teamed up around this idea of Muslims as the enemy. And to just give one example, we can think of Ayan Hirsi Ali and Robert Spencer. Some people watching may know these names, other people might not. Ayan Hirsi Ali is a former Muslim who gained a huge following, in a lot of like progressive circles, or like liberal circles. She's often been featured on NPR, written for the New York Times, very established herself as this voice on Islam, talking about the ills of Islam to kind of your NPR audience. And then you have someone like Robert Spencer, who is, on the political right, often is kind of in these like neocon circles, who's been affiliated with many anti-Muslim activities that have influenced Republican politics. And the two of them have actually endorsed each other's work, have worked together, have spoken on panels together, because ultimately they have the same negative views of Muslims. They have the same ideas about policies and how Muslims should be treated and those sorts of things. So it's, I think one of the really important things is just for readers and those on the political left to be aware that this is happening in our circles too. We can't just blame the right and say, oh, well, Trump was Islamophobic, but we're fine. No, we have a lot of work to do on this side of the spectrum too.
Yeah, definitely. So there's one point in the book where, when you first started in this field, you came across a survey that said Americans didn't personally know a Muslim person. And this led you, and I would argue, actually, a lot of others came to this conclusion, that knowing a Muslim would solve Islamophobia. With your continued work, you've realized this isn't the case. And you know specifically that we need to tackle the ignorance, but also the nefarious forces that both feed and capitalize on it. Islamophobia is interpersonal, institutional, and implicit, and it's generated and propped up by industry and imperialism. Can you expand on what you mean by this? And I think, you mentioned Ayan Hirsi Ali and Robert Spencer, and I think this is the perfect way into this conversation as well. So could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. So, in college, I remember reading that, this survey that talked about how many Americans didn't know someone who was Muslim. And I thought, oh man, I've had such positive experiences getting to know Muslims, as classmates in college. And if everyone could have this experience, then this problem of Islamophobia would go away. And then I spend more time learning about the Islamophobia industry and the role of government and the media and all these different kind of interlocking factors, and realized there's a lot more that needs to be done than people just meeting Muslims. And I will say it's really important. Like, interpersonal relationships have a huge role to play here. And studies have shown that meeting people meeting one person from a faith community shapes your perspective of the entire faith community, and usually leads people to have less stereotypical views about, that entire faith community and those sorts of things. So personal relationships are really impactful. And I think in a lot of ways, they inoculate people against some of the negative media that they might be consuming, or, these anti-Muslim stereotypes that so often circulate in our public discourse. But yeah, there's so much more at play here. And part of that is the Islamophobia industry, or the Islamophobia network, which is basically this cadre of bloggers, writers, political commentators, heads of think tanks and nonprofits who have worked together and have worked with different sectors of society to basically shape US public opinion, and then to also shape policy towards Muslims. And there's a lot of money involved. People benefit politically, socially, financially from the demonization of Muslims. And Islamophobia isn't going to go away if people simply get to know Muslims. We also have to call out and highlight and try to dismantle these other forces and these other structures that exist. Another thing that I'll say, kind of related to your question, is another kind of tension in this work of combating Islamophobia, which is what role does teaching about Islam as a religion play in combating Islamophobia? I don't think the work of combating Islamophobia is simply about teaching about Islam. I think actually a lot of readers might have come to this book thinking that this whole book was going to be like an Islam 101 book, like, oh, this is what Islam is, this is what Muslims believe, this is what Muslims do. And I do a little bit of that in the book, as you know, like in the note at the beginning of the book, and there's particular places in the book where I do actively debunk stereotypical or untrue claims made about Islam as a religion. But, I think, it's kind of when we do that, we're almost putting the blame on Muslims to say, okay, Muslims, you need to explain yourself and prove to us that you're not worthy of being discriminated against. And, one of the comparisons I give in the book is, when we teach people about anti-Semitism, bias, and bias against the Jewish people, our first step there is not to have people read the Hebrew Bible. Like, a lot of people say, oh, we need to combat Islamophobia by telling people to read the Quran. It's like, why are we putting, like, it doesn't make sense. It's putting the onus on the community, and it's also ignoring all of the actual factors, which is that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all these other forms of racism are forms of scapegoating. They're oftentimes the intentional marginalization of a community so that another community can benefit. And when we don't recognize that and we don't teach that, the problem is just going to persist. And I think we're always going to be playing this game of defense of, like, always answering these charges made about Islam rather than actually just calling out the scapegoating that's creating this in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, the Islamophobia industry, also a lot of these individuals will often use Islamic terminology, and they warp these terms. You talk about this in your book, and they warp these terms to justify their characterizations of what they're trying to put out there. And then it kind of becomes, if you start, obviously you want to dismantle that whole characterization of these words and these terms like Sharia and Jihad. But then it kind of just ends up going to a back and forth conversation when the larger issue is you're using these terms, you're characterizing in this manner to justify violence or discriminatory policies against Muslim communities. And I think you do a really wonderful job of outlining how the industry kind of does this. Moving on from the industry, you also, which is actually part of the industry, you also write about what you call the Catholic wing of the Islamophobia industry. What do you mean by that, and how is it connected to the broader transnational Islamophobia industry?
Yeah, so in part 2 of the book, as you know, I focus specifically on Islamophobia in Christian communities, and there's a chapter on contemporary Islamophobia among Christians. And because I myself am a Catholic Christian, I thought it was important to speak particularly to issues in the Catholic community. Also, I wanted to highlight this because so many other publications on Islamophobia have focused on evangelical issues in evangelical and Protestant communities, and in the way that as I'll talk about, the Islamophobia industry is kind of connected to many evangelical pastors and outlets and things like that. So one of the things that I found in my research with the Bridge Initiative some years ago was that this kind of transnational Islamophobia industry, which tries to kind of malign Muslims, reap the benefits, the financial benefits from that, and then shape policy, is that they also had a foothold in Catholic circles. I was doing all this research on how Catholics viewed Muslims and the kinds of things that Catholics were reading about Islam and Muslims. And I realized that so many of the authorities that Catholics were turning to were these figures in the
Yeah.
Islamophobia industry, particularly in the case of Catholics, Robert Spencer, who has since left the Catholic Church, but for many years was writing specifically for Catholics, in addition to his broader kind of public facing, like Fox News work. And so a lot of the stereotypical and harmful tropes that that Spencer and the like were promoting in mainstream media, Spencer was also kind of importing into his writing for Catholics, and writing books that were published by Catholic publishing companies, writing articles for primarily conservative Catholic outlets, and that sort of thing. And what I noticed is that there were also kind of smaller name individuals within the Catholic community who kind of took his mantle and kind of promoted his messaging and his work and disseminated it further into Catholic circles. And I don't think it quite has the intentional orchestration that the broader, like, as we were saying, transnational Islamophobia network has. But there is kind of this de facto network of Catholic voices and institutions who spread fear and misinformation about Muslims, and in some cases are funded specifically to do that. And I was really shocked to find that one of the main funders of Pamela Geller, who is a very famous Islamophobic activist that many people will know, they were also funding a Catholic specific project called the Turning Point Project, which is run by a man named William Kilpatrick, who has this writing gig where the goal is to, quote unquote, educate Catholics about the threat of Islam. So he is funded specifically by the Shillman Foundation to basically freak Catholics out about Islam and to spin out all of these articles and these narratives to kind of drive a wedge between Catholics and Muslims. And it's very concerning, and it's something that not a lot of people know about. And unfortunately, because these different Catholic authors cite one another, endorse one another, cross-post one another's work, it leads this to this Islamophobic way of thinking to become conventional wisdom in Catholic circles. And I mean, I have had many experiences where Catholics and sometimes Catholic priests will basically echo Robert Spencer-esque or William Kilpatrick-esque narratives about Muslims. And they can't tell me exactly often where they've gotten this information, but I know it's circulating in the community. And so it's something that I felt was important to draw attention to, in part, like also so Catholics can be aware, and then to maybe also push back against that too.
Yeah. I mean, like you're saying, there is such a network, and whether or not it's like formally organized, like you said, they cross-post each other, they promote each other's work, they kind of build off each other's arguments. You'll take it from one blog post to your own micro little blog post, your tweet about it. And I think it's important to mention, like, the likes of Geller and Spencer, they've been around for decades, and they were even before, social media became this big thing, and they had their own blogs. And then you had media that was giving them platforms. So they really became these big names. And then obviously with social media, you have a lot of other voices now as well. So going along that, in chapter 8, you chronicle some of the ways Christians have mistreated Muslims throughout history. Can you give us some examples of this and why you felt it was important to include it?
Yeah, so in chapter 8, that's where I talk about the roots of contemporary Islamophobia in the history of Muslim-Christian relations. So I go back into the history of conflict and coexistence between Christians and Muslims in Europe and elsewhere, and look at some of the things that influence our present day situation. Another thing that I do there is to draw attention to some of the ways throughout history that, as you said, Christians have mistreated Muslims in their midst. And I do that not to to make us feel super guilty or to say that we as Christians are unique in that regard, but rather because I think Christians are unaware of the
Yeah.
harm that we've committed, and it leads us to have this sense of an imbalance between ourselves and Muslims. We often see ourselves with these rose-colored glasses that, oh, we as Christians have always been kind and loving, and Muslims have been harmful towards us. I think many Christians know examples from history of Muslim violence against Christians or policies where Christians have been subordinated to Muslims in different contexts, but we have no clue that we've done the exact same thing. I myself was really surprised in doing the research for this book to learn some of these things. There were a couple councils in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages where the Catholic Church said that Jews and Muslims should be subordinated to Christians in certain ways in Christian polities, like that they should wear special clothing, that they shouldn't be able to marry, people of the Christian faith, those sorts of things. And I didn't grow up learning about that history, and I think many Christians don't. And unfortunately, I think being unaware of that history leads to also an incorrect view of ourselves and also an incorrect view of Muslims. Because if we only know about the bad that Muslims have done and we only know about the good that we have done, it's a lot easier to justify Islamophobia. It's a lot easier to justify mistreatment of Muslims because we feel like we're the victims and that they're the aggressors. But when we realize that both sides have harmed one another, but have also done tremendous good for the other, it makes it easier to say, okay, like we need to do our part, we can do our part, and we can work together with Muslims to build up, a better world for everybody.
Yeah, I think providing context, historical context, is so important because there is so much misinformation and just a lack of knowledge about how Muslim Christian relations have been throughout history. Sometimes it's often portrayed as it's just been, two opposing groups where, there's actually so much history about great relationships, great interactions. So yeah, having that historical overview, I think, is so important, especially to understand where we are today. So that I think was a really, really good part that I really appreciated. Going along that, you also talk about Catholic social teaching and how it can be applied to tackling anti-Muslim racism. Along with this, can you explain CST and what does solidarity look like from a Christian standpoint?
Yeah, so at the end of the book, what I wanted to do is remind Christians of the many resources that we have in our faith tradition that we can draw on to craft a positive response to Islamophobia. That we actually have so many theological, ethical, and practical resources for combating bigotry and to promoting positive relationships. And one of the things, particularly from the Catholic tradition, that I thought it was important to bring up is this thing called Catholic social teaching, which is basically a set of principles drawn from a bunch of different teaching documents in the Catholic Church that basically give us this broad roadmap for how to address different social issues. And so I'll talk about some of the principles in just a second, but CST has been applied to anti-Black racism, to environmental justice, to lots of different problems and issues that exist in our world. And so these principles are things like protecting human life and dignity, including religious liberty, solidarity, something called subsidiarity, which I can talk about, care for the common good, and a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. So I can talk about what some of these things are. But basically, Catholic social teaching rests on the foundation of the fact that human beings are created by God to live full, flourishing lives, and that we need to do all we can to protect the life and dignity of people. And so, I say at a very basic level, Islamophobia is a threat to human life. We could even say that it's a pro-life issue if we have kind of this expansive in the Catholic tradition kind of seamless garment view of what it is to be pro-life. If Muslims are dying because of Islamophobia, this is something that we should be concerned about if we're concerned about protecting human life. There's also this concept of subsidiarity, which is sometimes like touted by conservatives because it's kind of like, it can sometimes be like this idea that we should have small government, because the point of subsidiarity is that we should solve problems at the lowest level possible. Okay. So this basically means that if there's a problem that can be solved at the local level, let's try to solve it at the local level and then kind of move up as we need to. One of the things that also is connected to this is the fact that government overreach, which is so much a problem when it comes to Islamophobia and these institutional forms of Islamophobia, is a violation of this principle of subsidiarity. So when Muslims are being unjustly detained and incarcerated, when Muslims are being bombed abroad, all these other instances where Muslims are being treated poorly at the hands of government, this is a violation of this principle of subsidiarity that we have in Catholic social teaching. And then one of the other principles, and this gets to the latter part of your question, is solidarity. This idea that we need to stand with and for others, not in like a posture of like reaching down and helping those who are like less than us, but it's a posture of equality and standing with other people. And there are so many ways that we can do that. I think when there's an anti-Muslim hate crime in a community, for example, it's really important that Christians show up and show their support tangibly, emotional support, things like that. But I also think a huge part of solidarity when it comes to Islamophobia is doing work in our own Christian communities to combat stereotypes and combat problematic ways of thinking about and treating Muslims. So even though we might not be actually engaging with, we might not be in dialogue with Muslims or engaging with Muslims in a direct way, we're actually showing our solidarity when we're standing up for Muslims in our own faith community. So if a priest says something in a homily that is anti-Muslim, we don't let that slide by. We have hard conversations in our Christian communities. I think one thing that we can do is also to be transparent as Christians about our own grappling with the stereotypes that we've had and the hard and sometimes uncomfortable work it takes to address those and overcome those. Yeah. I think when we tell those stories of transformation, we actually allow people to go on that journey with us, because we're not saying, oh, you're a bigot, you shouldn't be like that. We're actually saying, no, I get it, and I've overcome, I used to think that way too, and I don't think that way anymore. So I could go on and on. As you know, there's a ton of examples in the book, but those are just a few of the things that I think that people can do.
And I think I really appreciated those stories of the transformation, because from someone who does Islamophobia research, from someone who reads about really horrible things happening around the world, seeing that someone can transform and recognize their views and then change those views is powerful. I think stories like that are very important, because sometimes you might often feel like, okay, are we ever going to overcome this? Are we ever going to solve this? But seeing individual stories is very important, because it does show you people can change and views can change. But like you said, it is, doing that hard work of within your own community, calling people out when you see, this is happening. I think that is starting at that local level, again, like you said, is very important. I'm going to shift a bit of gear here. I think this is a question that some people might be not know much about in terms of looking at anti-Muslim racism on a global scale. And I really appreciated that your book delved into this. I know this is a really big topic, but can you just briefly go over how Islamophobia has gone global and what the impact of the Western trope of, the Muslim as the terrorist other has had on Muslims around the world?
Yeah, so a lot of the book focuses on Islamophobia in the US and in Europe and in the West more broadly. And that's, in part because this is the context that I live in, and also because I think so much of, Islamophobia was in many ways born in the West and out of, the experience that like the West has had, with Muslims and that sort of thing. And particularly in this post 9/11 period, the stereotypes and the tropes that have formulated in the West have kind of been exported to other parts of the world or have been adopted in other parts of the world. And, in this section of the book, like I drew so much on your writing and research. So I want viewers to know that because it's really great work and I couldn't have done this section of the book without it. So, we have, we can think about, for example, what's going on in China with the internment and ethnic cleansing of Uyghur Muslims, where the Chinese government has basically framed their policies against Uyghurs as a kind of war on terror. They cast Muslims as this, Muslims in China as this internal enemy that's foreign, that's inherently dangerous, and that we need to eliminate if we want to have a peaceful society. And so by casting Muslims in this as this threat, they're able to justify this policy of, not just discrimination, but really, mass violence. We also see this going on in India with the Prime Minister Modi and Hindu nationalists who have also drawn on this kind of post 9/11 Muslim as terrorist trope to try to say that Muslims are foreign and are a threat to us and shouldn't be here, despite the fact that Muslims are just as indigenous to India as Hindus are. Muslims have a long history in India. And I should say in both China and India, Muslims are not the only ones being targeted by these government regimes. Christians are, and other groups are too. And I think that fact also drives home the reality that Islamophobic rhetoric and that these anti-Muslim tropes are tools that governments can use to engineer their kind of broader political projects of dominating certain groups. So it's, I do think there are a lot of people that genuinely believe these, anti-Muslim things, but I also think that governments like use them in a concerted way. They're tools. So, that's Islamophobia is not just an issue in the West. It's an issue in other places. The other thing I think it's important for people to know is that oppressive regimes in Muslim majority contexts also use this terrorist trope. Yes. Bashar al-Assad in Syria, whenever he wanted to try to delegitimize, the opposition, they were cast as terrorists, And also, and I wish I had talked more about this in the book than I did. This is also these anti-Muslim tropes are also instrumental in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, because Israel is able to justify its policy of dominance of the Palestinians because the Palestinians are equated with Muslim, violent, terrorist, that sort of thing. So when the Israeli public, or even when the American public believes that Palestinians are, kind of the quintessential terrorist Muslim, it's really easy to justify a policy of dominance over the Palestinians and to kind of give Israel a blank check to do whatever they want.
As you're saying, with this trope, what it does is the Muslim terrorist trope, it dehumanizes Muslims. It dehumanizes the individual. So then you don't see this individual as a person, you see them just clearly as a threat. And then that justifies and that makes it okay to carry out, incidences of mass violence and issues such as what we have in China with concentration camps, with where now they're using forced sterilization and forced abortion to basically cut down the population. And it's based on this trope of viewing Muslims as a threat, as terrorists, which then dehumanizes Muslims and then allows for these policies to be in place.
Yeah, and it's the same. I mean, it has the same effect in Western contexts too. I mean, it's very rare that, someone who's committing an anti-Muslim hate crime in the US is doing so because they realize that they're the aggressor and that they know that Muslims are victim. They're usually attacking the Muslim because they think that the Muslim is actually the aggressor. They think that the Muslim is the threat because they've been so conditioned to see Muslims as threatening and not as fully human.
Yeah.
And it's so ironic because you have someone who's actually perpetrating violence thinking that they're actually the one doing, like, being defensive against the primary aggressor. So there's just this whole cognitive dissonance, and that's what we have to call out, and that's what we have to draw attention to, this dynamic of dehumanization by casting other people as a threat.
Yeah. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm gonna move on to our 15 minutes of Q&A. If you do have a question, please do drop it into the Q&A chat function. So this is from Dr. Todd Green. He said, "Thank you so much for writing this book, Jordan. Question involves your engagement with Catholic Americans. In your experience of speaking to Catholics on Islamophobia, do you find many Catholics are aware of the Catholic Church's social teachings that you appeal to in your speaking and writing? And do you feel that many Catholics have awareness of the Catholic Church's social teachings and the Church's statement on interfaith engagement? Or do you find more often than not that you are in a position of teaching fellow Catholics the theological and ethical resources of their tradition?"
Thank you, Dr. Green, for that, and also for your work, which I cite numerous points in my book. It's funny you ask this because there are many contexts where I don't think Catholics are familiar with these important teachings from their own faith tradition. And like you said, I do have to kind of introduce to people for the first time these teachings. When I speak to students or audiences that are at Jesuit schools or have been formed in the Ignatian tradition, which many viewers will be familiar with, they might be familiar with these things, but a lot of Catholics aren't. And I mean, I grew up going to Catholic school and going to Jesuit school, and many of these were not presented to me for a long time, or maybe late in high school, or maybe not until college. I wouldn't have been exposed to them if I hadn't gone looking myself or made an active decision to study this. Yeah, but I'll just speak a little bit to the Church's statements on interfaith engagement, which Dr. Green mentions. There are a couple documents that came out of the Second Vatican Council, which was this big gathering of bishops in the 1960s, where the Church was sort of reflecting on how can we open ourselves to the modern world. For so long, the Church had kind of had this attitude of, we need to hunker down and be closed in on ourselves and be resistant to the changes of the modern world. And in the 1960s, the Church was trying to say, okay, how can we actually open ourselves to the world, not be operating from a posture of fear, but one of openness, and that doesn't see difference as a threat to who we are. And so this is the first time actually when the Catholic Church has taught, issued teaching documents that speak about Muslims in a positive way. And there are two lines or two portions from these documents that I think are really important and that I like to educate Catholics about, because many people don't know about them. The first is in a document called Nostra Aetate, which was all about the Church's relationship to other religious communities. And its paragraph on Muslims starts by saying, the Catholic Church holds Muslims in high regard, period. or like depending on the translation, the Catholic Church, respects Muslims and sees them with esteem or something. And then it goes on to list all these similarities that Christians have with Muslims that are part of the basis for why we view Muslims positively, in addition to like all of the just like human reasons why we should have a positive attitude towards other people. But I think that's really important for Christians to know, because it tells us that our default attitude towards Muslims isn't supposed to be a negative one. It's not even really supposed to be one of neutrality. It's supposed to be one that acknowledges, like, one of respect, one that is out of love. It doesn't mean that we have to even know these people very well, but that like our default attitude should be a positive one, and one that's willing to learn from and work with other people. And the other really important part of these documents is that the church declares that Christians and Muslims together worship the one God. And that is something that I get a lot of pushback from in Christian and Catholic circles. And in some ways it's understandable, because Christians and Muslims do have theological differences, and we do have differences in the kinds of things that we're willing to or not willing to affirm about God. For example, Christians affirm a belief in the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus, things that Muslims do not affirm, that Muslims reject. But despite those differences, the church reminds us that Muslims are also oriented towards the one God. And we also have these same theological differences with the Jewish community, and we're willing to affirm that Jews also worship the one God. So I think we also need to extend, like, by that logic, we also need to affirm that about Muslims. So yeah, I think these are really important and kind of mind-boggling teachings for people when they hear them the first time. And I wish I didn't have to be the first one to introduce, that I wasn't the first one introducing people to these, because they should be a basic part of Catholic education, and unfortunately they're not.
Well, I think, more reason for people to check out this book. So this other question we have, Anoma Nabi, have you heard of Saharazi's newest book on how Muslims are seen as a race when they are discriminated and deal with Islamophobia? So you actually touch on the racialization of Muslims, and I think that's super important to cover. Would you be able to talk about the racialization of Muslims?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have seen Dr. Aziz's new book, and I haven't got my hands on it yet, but I'm excited to read it. So in the section of the book where I define Islamophobia, I talk about this issue of the racialization of Muslims. And I think a lot of Christians or readers might kind of bristle at that, because they're like, well, Muslims aren't a race. And yes, that's true. Like, Muslims are a very diverse population of believers who are from all parts of the world. But what we mean when we say that Muslims are racialized is that in our kind of public imagination, we envision all Muslims to be a monolith, that all Muslims have the same like intrinsic and inheritable traits, in a sense that, and these could be appearance related, and they could also be like kind of behavioral traits that we ascribe to Muslims. So, we assume that Muslims are brown, are from the Middle East, we assume they look a certain way and they wear certain kinds of clothing. But then we also assume that they are more prone to violence than other people, that that Muslim men have a penchant for being oppressive to women, that they're tyrannical, these sorts of things. And I mean, I think it's rare that people are going to say that they consciously hold all of these ideas, but like they're implicit and they're there. And we see them manifested in the way that Muslims are treated. But yeah, basically this is one of the ways that, this is how Islamophobia operates. It's by reducing Muslims to this block of kind of dehumanized, threatening people, and then treating Muslims differently because of that. And it plays out in really like not interesting, that's not the right word to use, but um, some really like troubling ways, because it means that, you know, some Muslims are treated worse because of certain way that they look, but it also means that once people find out, like say someone's a white Muslim, sometimes when people find out that they're Muslim, then they'll start to treat them differently, because it's like, oh, well, like you're also, you have these, you might not look Muslim in the way that we think that you should look, but oh, you're not to be trusted too. So it plays out in the way people are treated because of the way they look, but then also um, other sorts of things. I talk in the book about how Muslim children are often seen as a threat, because it's like, oh, well, they're little like terrorists in the making because Muslims are inherently violent.
Yeah.
These sort, and we see policies in the UK and elsewhere where Muslim children have been the subject of like government scrutiny and other like anti-terrorism programs, because the assumption is that Muslims are inherently violent, and even as children,
Yeah.
we need to watch out for what they might grow up to do, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think going off the racialization, that also explains why non-Muslims are targeted by
Yeah.
anti-Muslim hate crime. So, the Sikh community in the US has been targeted. The first person that was murdered after 9/11 was a Sikh, Balbir Sodhi Singh was he worked at a gas station. He was murdered because the individual who shot him thought he was Muslim.
Yeah.
So that explains also why non-Muslims have been on the receiving end of Islamophobia.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's something, as you know, that I talk about in the book too. And I said at the beginning of this conversation that Islamophobia doesn't target Christians, but actually it does. I mean, I
Mhm.
give examples of Christians who have been violently attacked and in some cases killed because people thought they were Muslim. I
Yeah.
give the example of Khalid Jabara in I think it was Oklahoma several years ago now. His neighbor had already he's an Arab Christian, Arab Orthodox Christian, and his neighbor had already attacked his mother at one point. And then when he ultimately came and killed Khalid, he used a range of slurs, including anti-Muslim slurs. So it goes to show how like all of these different forms of bigotry are kind of bound up with each other, and that Arabness and Muslimness and looking brown, whatever that means, like are all kind of folded together, and perpetrators can't always like parse all these things out, but it leads to so many people being harmed, and it's really awful. The thing, again, to go back to the Sikh community that is so inspiring is that Sikhs could so easily say, kind of do a PR campaign, be like, hey, we're not Muslim, don't attack us,
Mhm.
but they have refused to throw Muslims under the bus in that way, and said, obviously it's important to educate people about the differences between our communities, but we're not doing it because we want to like leave Muslims to experience this.
Yeah.
It's rather we need to combat Islamophobia so that Muslims aren't harmed, so that we aren't harmed. We're not going to just look out for our own community, but we need to make sure that everybody who's affected by Islamophobia is taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 2 more minutes left. I'm
Okay.
gonna quickly, if you're able to answer, this is from Nazir, who previously worked with us at Bridge. Hi, Nazir. He said, we saw a scary wave of Islamophobia during the 2016 elections. What worries you about Islamophobia today and for the next 5 years?
I think my biggest worry is that people stop paying attention to it.
Mm,
You and I know that anti-Muslim hate crimes, government programs, all of these things are still going on, but they're not making the headlines in the way that they did when Trump was running for office.
absolutely.
And I just hope that people, in my community don't get complacent. At the same time, I think we need to celebrate the progress that we've made, and to acknowledge the progress that we've made. I think the next push really is to kind of dismantle some of these anti-Muslim tropes and stereotypes in liberal circles, and I see my book as part of that. I know there are a lot of people who are going to read this book who, didn't like Trump's Islamophobia, but might not be aware of all of the ways that it still persists in more subtle ways, in the broader culture and in the political left. So I think that's really important. I mean, and at the same time, though, we know that like some of the most egregious anti-Muslim actions that have happened in North America have happened within the last month. I mean, looking at Canada, with the killing of the family there. So, it's all still ongoing, and I just think we have to put in the hard work to do what we can to alleviate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jordan. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. A quick thank you to Andrew Condon, ACMCU's Digital Communications Manager, for his help in putting this event together. And finally, everyone, please be sure to pick up your copy of Jordan's new book, Islamophobia: What Christians Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination. Thank you also. Please do follow Bridge on social media, on Twitter, and be sure to follow Jordan on Twitter. And do check out Bridge's resources on our website. We have fact sheets, articles on Islamophobia, not just in the US, but around the globe. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.